If you are playing or writing synth or keyboard parts and find yourself coming up with chord progressions that are kind of basic and, dare I say, boring, you may be using what I like to call the T-Rex producer method. And that's just where you play triads, like this. Today I'm going to show you a couple of quick, relatively simple ways to make those kinds of progressions that you may just improvise with your little T-Rex fingers much more interesting. What I've just played are some root position triads. Root position just means that the root of the chord, the home note if you will, is in the bass. It's the bottom note of the chord. Now we can flip these chords around so that they're no longer in root position and therefore give ourselves a lot more options for making the progressions more interesting by taking the bottom note and putting it on top. That's called an inversion. Specifically, when I move the C from the bottom to the top, that is the first inversion of a C major triad. I could do that one more time, take the bottom note again, and put it on top. And that is a second inversion. If we did that one more time, we're back in root position. So anytime we have a triad, we only have two possible inversions because there are only three notes to deal with. So how exactly does inverting chords help make our progressions more interesting? You didn't ask? Well, I'll tell you anyway. If I take that same progression and just invert the second, the third, we're going to transpose the last chord down by an octave but leave it in root position, I end up with something like this. I could invert that a second time to have a more interesting linear melodic idea. The top note often is what we think of as our melody. That's the exact same set of chords that I had at the beginning. We've made a more linear chord progression. In other words, we can think about how each part or each note moves to the next note. So we're thinking more like a choir or maybe a string orchestra would think, where we have like one player per part and each part gets its own individual line. We can take this a step further and do something called a redistribution, which is similar to an inversion, but I'll show you the difference. If I take my C major triad, I'm going to put it down here. Using the T-Rex method I showed you earlier. I'm going to put it down here, and I'm just going to transplant the E from the middle of this chord and put it an octave higher. This is still a root position chord because the C is still in the bass, so the root of the chord is still the bass note. Therefore, not an inversion, but a redistribution or a revoiced C major triad. Already has a little bit more space to it, and maybe we can pick out the melody line, the top voice, a little bit more distinctly because it's removed from the rest of the chord. That would be one example of a redistributed version of this exact same progression we started with. I could take it a step further and add inversions alongside redistribution in the next example. That's just more interesting to me. I can feel like it's developing over time, and I can also imagine that it might go someplace in the future. It just has a musical shape to it. Another really useful technique, getting into the world of non-functional harmony just ever so slightly, is I could extend these triads. So starting out with the triads I began with, I'm just going to stack two more thirds on top of that initial triad. I'm going to do the same thing to the next chord, and the one after that, and the one after that. These would be examples of extended tertian triads. Tertian simply meaning thirds, 3 stacked thirds. Extended simply meaning that we're extending beyond the root position triad. You may have heard of a 7th chord before. You may have even heard of a 9th chord or an 11th chord or a 13th chord. And that's where those come from. Because the distance from the bottom to the top note is how we get that particular number. So this would be a 5th from the bottom to the top. If I stacked another third on top, that's a 7th. If I stacked another third on top, that's a 9th. If I stacked another third on top, that would be an 11th and a 13th. So in this case, I've got a bunch of parallel 9th chords. Which already sounds pretty cool. I mean, that's fairly interesting, but I think we can take it a step further and incorporate all that stuff that we learned at the beginning of this video. One thing that I really enjoy doing is just figuring out which notes I might want to omit out of a chord like this. So maybe something like so you can find interesting voicings just simply by removing some notes from a very harmonically rich chord. But the main thing I want to show you is we can take those same two concepts that we learned earlier, inversion and redistribution, and also apply them to these 9th chords, and it's going to give us a lot more options because we have more notes. So if I start with this, I'm going to start it on the E. So it is a first inversion 9th chord. I don't really care what you name it, but if we use all those same notes and simply revoice them, we can come up with something really interesting. And then we can revoice the next one, and then we can invert and revoice the next one. So many different permutations, different things we can try when we're using this method. I think that's a pretty cool progression. I could do the same thing with this and figure out which notes I might want to omit from that progression. Just to make the voicing a little bit more interesting. And depending on how I orchestrate this, that could lead to some very different results. But either way, just by using inversions, redistributions, learning a little bit about non-functional harmony and extending these triads, we've already come up with a lot of ways to make this very simple progression much more interesting, linear, or as I like to say, horizontal instead of vertical. In other words, each one of the parts aligns at a certain point to make the harmony instead of just thinking in blocked chords all the time. If you want more examples of how I like to think about harmony in this kind of way, I did make a free ebook for you, which is down in the description below. It'll be the first link if you want to check that out. But I think I'm going to try this with a little arpeggio mixed in as well and see what it sounds like.